This lady was so very good.
Invités distingués, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers amis. My name is Margaret Huber. I have the honor of being the president of the Canadian International Council's National Capital Branch. For those of you who are here for the first time, bienvenue. For those who are coming back, like my friend Paul Chapin, welcome back. Great decision to come back. And we are tonight, I do believe, in a celebratory mood. Not just because Ottawa won the Great parade downtown today. I don't know those of you who are able to attend that. But particularly, we're in a celebratory mood, ladies and gentlemen, because we have such a terrific panel to offer you tonight on Canada at the United Nations. I will ask Randolph Harold, our Vice President, who will be moderating the panel discussion. I will be asking him to introduce the members after I just say a few more introductory words to let you know, those of you who are still new to the organization, about what a rich palette of events we try to offer you, not only at these evening signature events, but also through the 5 working groups, through the very popular Politics at the Pub events, as well as Youth Expo, which are kind of like speed dating between practitioners and students who are about to enter the working world and are looking to you all for those who have been practitioners, looking to you for some guidance in that regard. Guidance that they probably disregard, but at least they can hear the words of guidance. But I know that George Jacoby, who is our programming director for events, working with Christina Warren and other colleagues, are busy in preparing a very robust program of activities for the new year. I'm looking here at topics that we're planning to move forward on: European security and Russia. Canada contends with a Trump administration. Match from the U.S. Embassy. We'll have to work on that title a little bit. We'll also be looking at the new national security oversight system. We're also planning something on the Middle East, where our Governor General has just come back from, and we have continued to have hopes that there might be some progress there. We're planning something on Arctic sovereignty, the international aspects, and our Latin America working group is working up something that I know will be very exciting. All this to say, lots happening. Stay tuned. Thank goodness that you are all so plugged in with the internet, so we can reach you and send you notifications, and you can check whether or not your busy programs can accommodate yet another event with us. We sure hope that it will. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're privileged this evening to have with us someone who has not been in Ottawa that long, and that is the representative in Ottawa of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the Honourable Mr. Vanderklaw. If you could stand up so that... Thank you. this evening. Thank you, all of you, for coming. And Randolph, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. We're very privileged to have three outstanding Canadians with us tonight. They're top experts in UN matters and foreign policy. And what's even more of a pleasure for me is having known and worked with Louise and Paul for some time. Louise Fréchette, OC, was the first United Nations Deputy Secretary General, serving in that post for 8 years. A long-time Canadian diplomat and public servant, she is currently at the Centre for International Governance and Innovation and International Relations Policy think tank in Waterloo. Louise is working on a major research project on nuclear energy and world security. Much earlier in her career, in 1985, she was named Canada's ambassador to Argentina and subsequently was sent on a secret mission to Cuba to lobby Fidel Castro to support the Gulf War. How did that work out? Okay. In 1992, Louise was named Canada's ambassador to the United Nations, and after 3 years in New York, she left the Foreign Service to become Assistant Deputy Minister of Finance in Ottawa. Louise was later appointed Deputy Minister of National Defense, the first woman to hold that position. In 1997, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan offered Louise the newly created position of Deputy Secretary General. She was responsible for overseeing numerous reforms at the UN and dealt with issues during many Middle East crises, including the war in Iraq. In 1998, Louise Fréchette was made an officer of the Order of Canada. Catherine Kate White is the President and CEO of the United Nations Association in Canada. Welcome, Kate. She has creatively and successfully led the association since 2003 as it meets its important mandate across the country. Previously, Kate had been the head of Black and White Incorporated, an Ottawa-based international consultancy specializing in policy research, education, citizen engagement, and integrating risk management into initiatives and solutions. Her leadership in issues ranging from youth at risk, climate change, disaster and crisis response, corporate social responsibility, international conflict resolution, and peace building has gained her national and international recognition. Her policy and public engagement work included initiatives on the use of civil dissent in multilateralism, on the role of third-party facilitators in peace negotiations, and on the role of civil society in solution seeking. In Cyprus, this led to the Annan Accord. Kate White currently serves as Vice Chair of the Executive Committee of the World Federation of UN Associations. Paul Heinbecker, whom many of you know, now retired. You are retired, are you? Is a former Canadian ambassador to Germany and ambassador to the United Nations in New York. He has served as number 2 at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, driving the successful Acid Rain Accord. He served in more junior positions in Ankara, Stockholm, and at the OECD. In Ottawa, Paul was Chief Foreign Policy Advisor to then Prime Minister Mulroney. He was Assistant Secretary to Cabinet for Foreign Policy and Defense and Assistant Deputy Minister for International Security and Global Affairs in the Department of Foreign Affairs. Paul was an architect of Canada's human security agenda, helped negotiate an end to the Kosovo War, headed the Canadian delegation to the climate change negotiations in Kyoto, and was the last Canadian ambassador to sit on the UN Security Council. At the UN, He was a leading opponent of the Iraq War and an advocate of the International Criminal Court and the doctrine of the responsibility to protect. So, Prime Minister Trudeau's recent speech at the United Nations in New York signals his government's return to full engagement with the UN on peace and security issues, on refugees, and on climate change. Has Canada now come full circle with respect to the UN since the failure to gain a Security Council seat and the recent years of downgrading relations with the UN? What are your perspectives from your experience and involvement on Canada's role and the successes of its past initiatives? Louise, will you start us off?
Oh, I will with pleasure. It's the traditional first words you utter. Is this on? First, before I answer your question, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. And frankly, the main reason for me to be here is not so much my love of the UN, but my great pleasure in seeing former colleagues and every chance I get to get together with former colleagues and meet new friends in Ottawa, I do so. So thank you very much. Thank you for mentioning my association with CG and the work on nuclear energy. That has now come to an end. But I'd like to put in a good word for an organization I've been involved in for nearly 10 years now, which is CARE Canada, and now CARE International. It's a great organization, and we feel inclined to support an organization involved in humanitarian and development. Please think of CARE. I look at Paul, and he's got his written notes. I'm reading word. That wasn't my plan. So I'm going to make just a few brief remarks on, in a sense, our past history with the UN. Nowadays, when one mentions the UN, there's a whiff of nostalgia. It's not seen as something that is quite relevant today. And there's an element of sentimentality around the very notion that we should be actively engaged in the UN. But it is to forget that the birth of the UN was not sentimental at all. It was grounded in a very strong conviction that if you didn't want a repeat of the two world wars that had taken, 60 million victims, 90 million victims, you needed to have some common rules that all countries would respect and adhere to, and that's the fundamental of the UN. It's not a place that you go to because you want to do good things. It's a place that you go to because you think it's important for your own security and for the defense and promotion of your own interests. It does entail, at the same time, a disposition to work with others, to seek common ground. But it isn't charity, it isn't religion. I think it's a very, very important tool in international relations to ensure as best one can that there is some order in the world and some willingness on the part of the international community to settle their dispute according to agreed rules. And I think that's exactly what motivated Canada for decades to be actively engaged in the UN, because we're not a big power and we have always considered that our interests would be better defended through international norms and strong international institutions. And we were ready to invest a lot of efforts, and I'd say not only financial efforts, but a lot of brain power into the construction of this world order based on rules, on norms, and on international cooperation. you just take the example of the law of the sea. When I joined Foreign Affairs, the law of the sea was the thing that was happening. And frankly, the negotiators of the law of the sea were considered to be the kind of elite of the Foreign Service. And they were told that if there's anybody here who was involved in the law of the sea, I'm not talking about you. But the fact is, it was a very clear priority of the Canadian government at the time. Not because we wanted to be good and kind to others, it's because we have 3 oceans and a lot of ocean space to protect, and we needed the framework of the law of the sea to protect these interests. So over the years, I think Canada has been successful in the UN in contributing to the elaboration of new norms, to the strengthening of the various institutions that gravitate in and around the UN, because it was a priority for us, because we put a lot of very good brains behind it, and because we, as a country that has the means, as well as the desire to contribute to this construction of an order, we were able to play a role that, in fact, very few countries around the world can play, because they're too small or they're too poor. They don't have the back office, the back office support that allows you to play a very active, proactive role in international negotiations. When you think of it, even today, there's, I don't know, maybe 30 countries in the world, 40 countries that have this depth of capacity of knowledge, and not all of them want to play in that environment of norm making and norm design. So we have the not only the will, but we have the means, and people say, "Oh well, you were Boy Scouts, you were do-gooders." But in fact, if you hold the pen in a negotiation, we always volunteer to hold the pen. If you hold the pen, there's one set of interests you're not going to sacrifice. It's your own. At the same time, you have to find formulations, solutions that will rally the largest number of people around a step forward that you've identified. And by being actively engaged, you actually are better placed to defend your own interests and your own values and your own vision than if you stay outside. This is a tradition that I think has served us well. I hope that when we address the following questions, we will come back to this question of whether is it still worth it to invest in these kinds of multilateral efforts. You can guess my answers, but I'll give it later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you very much. Paul?
Comment on that? Absolutely. Louise and I are going to, and Kate are going to descend into violent agreement. One of the things that's difficult for people sometimes to get their mind around is that the UN is not a separate executive entity that can do what it wants to do. The UN is a club. It's run by its members, and in fact, it's mostly run by the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. So when people rail at the UN, they're really railing at the member countries, and it's kind of pointless to be pointing fingers at a building on First Avenue in New York, or the professional secretariat that lives there. The problems that the UN deals with are large, they're intractable, they don't come unless they are. I'm thinking particularly of the Security Council. And you have members of the Security Council who are protecting their own interests, particularly. So the idea that somehow you can, you should condemn the UN for being what it is, for being what we created it to be, with vetoes, as Louise has often reminded me, if there were no vetoes for the Russians, and especially in the Americans, there would be no UN. They would not accept a situation in which they could be outvoted on issues of peace and war. So you're stuck with a veto. And you can rail about, and I rail about it. Every day I open a newspaper and I see how terrible things have come in Syria. I want to be able to go down and throttle the Russian ambassador. But at the same time, that's the system we set up, and we're not going to be able to get out of it. There's always talk of creating an organization of democracies. An organization of democracy sounds good, but they aren't the problem most of the time. Some of the time, I guess I would say, the world might judge Vietnam and the invasion of Iraq to be the problem created by the democracies. But nevertheless, you cannot deal with the issues you have to deal with if you're only talking to people who agree with you, because there's others that are there. And in fact, what we're seeing, and I'll come to that later, is we're seeing a much greater diffusion of power. We've seen it in Syria. We're seeing it across the board. It's becoming more and more concerning, and that makes the UN both more and less important. One thing that I'd like to say along the lines of what Louise has said, and one thing I'd like to note is that in the time when Prime Minister Mulroney was in office, we participated in every single peacekeeping mission as a matter of principle. Another matter of principle was that we had to pay our dues on the first day of January every year, which meant that working in his office, I had to work on the first day of January every year and report to him that indeed the check had been taken from the mission in New York over to the UN Secretariat, or some other person who was working on New Year's received it, because it had to be on day one.
Thank God.
But the thing that I'd like to come back to is people will say, well, the UN is really not a, it's not really an interest, it's a value. It's something that we do because it's nice to do. But it really is really the wrong end of the stick. Good governance, you can say the same thing about good governance. You could say the same thing about the Ottawa Police Department. They're not an end. It never means to an end. The means to an end is a happy life. So if you take that view and you apply it to the UN, maybe the UN is a value as well as an interest. But does anybody really believe that Canada has an interest in a world in which there are no rules and no regulations? And would you like to live in that world? And by the way, as I'll suggest later, you may be about to get that opportunity.
Thanks very much, Paul. Kate White, maybe we could have a bit of a perspective from the civil society point of view. I know right now you are the CEO of the UN Association in Canada. Could you briefly walk us through the mission and mandate of that organization, and then talk about your involvements before you joined the UN and all your efforts in conflict resolution and peace building, such as happened in Cyprus, and how those went, just to get us started.
Well, thank you very much for that, and it's a pleasure for me to be here with you and, of course, with my distinguished colleagues. I want to give an enormous shout out to CIC. This engagement of civil society, of Canadians who care about international issues, is the core, really, of an informed and critical body, whoever is the government of the day. So congratulations on this wonderful evening, and thank you for including me in it. Of course, it's going to be my great pleasure to tell you a little bit about my work with UNA Canada, but I want to do a couple of quick chases because I've got the microphone. Both of Paul and Louise's comments. First of all, I want to say that if we're casting back, and that's what Louise got to do a little bit of, as well as Paul, that I will tell you that I believe some of the lessons that we learned as a civil society organization working with the previous government has prepared us well for working with the government south of the border. And I mean that as a realist and an optimist. And of course, I wouldn't be doing the job that I am if I wasn't both of those things. In other words, if that's what the reality is, now what are we going to do? In terms of paying our dues at the first of every year, there continued to be at least a tacit acknowledgement that Canada ought to do that under the previous government. On the other hand, there were significant resources, including institutional funds, that Canada had a history of contributing in a disciplined way with expectations of results that were not paid. And this will give you a little hint of the role of civil society in UNA Canada. Those were some of the issues and the heavy lifting that we were able to do, including, I might say, in a case of a missing $200 million to the largest development agency, which is, of course, UN Development Program, UNDP, is to say, we're going to have this conversation in Calgary. We're going to make sure that the energy sector and the financial sector is there, and that the Calgary Herald headline at the end of our program to raise attention to the need to pay this bill was Calgary welcomes the UN. So this kind of strategic mischief, if I can say, is, I hope, one of the disciplined contributions of civil society. The United Nations Association in Canada is as old as the UN itself, in fact, technically older. Paul knows this as a former board member, and let me also give a shout out to my very dear friend and colleague Penny Collinette at the back of the room, who's also on our current board of directors. We're the Canadian Commission for the League of Nations in advance of wisely switching to become the United Nations Association in Canada. But I will tell you about the history of the organization that casts back about 97 years, including with good people like you running branches. We have wonderful documents on Paul Martin Sr. running a branch in Windsor as an example, and again, why we value the role of civil society as such an important one. I will tell you that with the support of the board, we frame ourselves at the World Federation of the United Nations level as the people's movement of the UN. But I would say at the UNA Canada level, we're also a helpful critic of the organization. In other words, it's not an organization of just blind cheerleaders. We meet our mandate of growing global citizens through a series of branches, much like you. We have 20 across the country, over 20,000 members from coast to coast to coast. And of course, that gives me the privilege of strength and the board privilege of strength in talking to elected officials. As an example of another model, talking about climate change, I know we'll get to this, but I'm thinking when we had a government that wasn't so supportive and wasn't seeing its responsibilities as key on the issues of climate change, UNA Canada, as a nonpartisan organization, simply worked with subnational governments who were showing leadership, who did want to be at the table, some of them with their own conservative governments. And you can imagine the most important way to move things forward is to find partnerships where you can elevate. We have a small staff of about 25 professionals, largely in Ottawa, but across the country. And for any young people or parents of young people in the room, I'll tell you about a program called Canada Green Corps that we are in the process of selecting candidates for. And this builds on many years, about 20 years, of a very prestigious UN internship program where we identified terrible numbers on youth and underemployment with a need to escalate the green economy. And so this program will place talented but underemployed young Canadians in both old economy organizations, I'm hoping in energy companies, but also in green startups and so Brenda, when you talked about some of the previous work that I did, and Cyprus is a perfect example, where I think the role of civil society sometimes is just posing a question. I see some of my colleagues from civil society maybe in the room that recognizes whether we deserve it or not, and I'll say one of the other things that UN in Canada is poll Canadians on UN issues and emergent issues. But we are trusted by citizens as not having the same interests as the private sector, as other sectors, and so on. So simply asking the questions. In this case, it was working with a very tiny peace community in southern Cyprus. Very tiny, I might say. Most citizens didn't see a need for it. They were doing very well, thank you very much. Their concerns about the economy in the north were not high on their list. But asking the same questions, I'm a sociologist by training. So I trained some folks to do the same thing. In other words, what is the role of civil society? And likewise doing that in the north. In the north, there was confusion about what civil society was. Somebody allowed that, maybe it was Greenpeace or it was something in London and far away from them. And of course we asked, well, do you play soccer? Do you have sports teams? Do you have faith groups or school groups? This too is civil society. From simply posing those questions, when I left with my team of researchers, I got a message from the North saying that they had banded together a group of 50 civil society organizations, and this is from a group that didn't believe they had civil society organizations, and had written the first draft of what became known as the Annan Accord. I think that's just one of the models that we've continued to use, be flexible, and in the interest of building global norms.
Super, thanks you very much. And so Justin Trudeau's declared re-engagement with the UN is pretty important to you, I would think. And Paul, what do you think? What effect and successes will it likely have in peace and security, on refugees, and on climate change? His initiative in September gave people a lot of energy, I think, but what are the impediments to the current environment?
I was going to talk about question 3.
Okay, sure. Well, let's go on then. Yes.
As a follow-on to Kate, I hope very much that the UN Association will be an important voice of civil society to deepen the understanding of the world in Canada. The UN is the world. And in order for Canada to be effective in the UN, to take initiatives, to establish its priority, it's got to be rooted and grounded in a deep understanding of the world and where it is. And perhaps it's the fact that I live as part of the world in the UN Secretariat for 10 years, where the Canadian perspective was not my first concern, but I have to understand the whole, that I worry a little bit about the kind of coverage we get of international affairs, the kind of angles we get on issues and on countries that don't necessarily serve us well. And I'm very, very happy with the decision of the current government to re-engage with the UN. And they've taken a number of concrete steps that I think are all fine by me. I think they all make sense. But I'm just a little worried that the perception that they communicate may not necessarily be totally in tune with what the world has become. I was a little worried about the Prime Minister's speech to the UN, for instance, which had a lot to do with us and with middle class concerns and the fact that
middle
we're
class 5 times.
yeah, and you know, if you understand the world, the middle class concern is something that's very true in the Western world, but that's not the #1 preoccupation outside. The notion that we're here to help bothered me a little bit because you now have in the South a lot of countries with a lot of capacity who want to work with you, but they're not there to be helped. They want partnerships. And so, to me, getting a deeper understanding of where the world is at, and I think Paul has a lot to say about where the world is going south of the border.
Yeah, on what the government is doing, I think it has succeeded in rebranding itself, rebranding Canada, at least at the UN. Because before we were perceived as reluctant. We were sitting on the sidelines and we were carping at the people who were playing the games. And now I think that they have, by virtue of their enthusiasm, they have basically established in people's mind that they really do want to participate in the UN. They may not have a perfect understanding of what that means, but they are now engaged. Now, the next thing they have to do is to actually accomplish some things, and that's what they're about. We're seeing them on peacekeeping. They've made a commitment to participate in a major peacekeeping mission. They've devoted a lot of money to what they call peace support operations as well. On climate change, both they've provided a great deal of money and they have committed themselves to a process. The proof of that pudding will be in the eating. I negotiated the Kyoto Accord, and I'm still waiting for some of that to be. And they have brought a successful conclusion to the Global Fund conference in Montreal, and contributed a substantial amount of money from Canada itself, $800 million, I think, in addition. And on top of that, they have they got the rest of the community to commit almost $13 billion, which is a very large amount of money. The point is that they're more engaged and they're trying to accomplish things. They're going to be leading on the financing of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. One of the things that remains to be seen is they have essentially followed the same pattern of voting and policy on the Middle East, on the Arab-Palestinian or the Palestinian-Israeli issue. But at the same time, they have decided to fund UNRWA, which is a significant step forward as well. So there's the question on my mind then becomes, you know, they're in tough with the countries they're competing with. They're competing with Norway, which basically walks on water at the UN. It has more money for aid than anybody else does. It seems to be very effective politically, the Oslo Accord and other accords, including Colombia and elsewhere. So, you know, it's a small country, but it's a formidable one. And the other is Ireland, and Ireland is also a small country, but it has been leading on refugee issues. It has also, you know, you can always point to its big brother in Brussels and say we're going to finance your development via Brussels. You know, you can count on us to deliver money from Brussels. So, and they've both been in the game in the contest longer than we have. So they've been racking up commitments. So the question then becomes, with the suite of policies we're following, is that going to be enough to persuade the international community that we should be elected? And I would, I guess, observe that there are something like 70 Arab and Muslim countries. And if you're in the position, and if you don't get their vote, you subtract 70 from 193, That gives you 123. That's not enough to get elected.
Thank you very much, Paul. Louise, you had a comment?
On the question of the Security Council raise, I think we should retire that we're back. Apparently one of our opponents is going around saying, yeah, but we never left. Secondly, one has to bear in mind that the vote is cast by ambassadors to the UN, and it's a secret vote. So whatever governments tell us about their preferences on the vote, the inside the Beltway game is extraordinarily important. And there you're dealing with professionals of diplomacy. They care not only about how much money you give, and that's a factor that is relatively less important than in the past, because many developing countries are less and less dependent on foreign aid. It's still part of their economic environment, but it's not as central as it used to be. So it's not because you have a generous aid program or even a more generous program that you will necessarily win the votes as you did some 10 years or 20 years ago. But also the professionals watch not only what you do and how much money you give, but they watch what you say. And I think you put your finger on the most sensitive issue, how we respond to the plethora of issues in the Middle East will have a big impact on how all these ambassadors decide to vote in the end. And we have to watch for how we respond to unexpected crises in other parts of the world. In other words, the race for the seat on the Security Council involved not only your UN policy, it involved your foreign policy writ large.
Thank you, Louise. So I guess we all agree that we may say that Canada is back in the game, but the U.S. is not as of late January, which means the UN is not going to find a road back to real effectiveness anytime soon, unfortunately, I would think. If I can offend you for just a moment, Mr. Trump has declared, and I'm quoting here, so don't be offended, that we will bomb the shit out of IS with Russian help, that he will tear up the Paris Accord and stop climate change funding to the UN, and build a wall to keep out illegal immigrants, even worse, for refugees. And he doesn't like the nuclear deal with Iran. So what are the prospects for Canada's key policy with this kind of leadership from the U.S.?
That's intended for me. It's all true. I mean, the future depends to some extent, considerably, on Trump not being the person we think he is.
Yes.
There's an attempt at normalization taking place as people jockey for jobs in the new administration and tell everybody, that the emperor really is clothed. But it's not so obvious. But it's not just, I come back to the Americans, but it's not just the Americans. We're seeing a kind of a slow disintegration, if that's the right word, or the belief in multilateral cooperation is beginning to fall apart. International law, which we have always considered to be a rock on which to stand in the flood of international relations, is starting to come apart as well. If you look at one such instrument is the International Criminal Court. International Criminal Court, the Africans are beginning to come to the conclusion that this was a court meant for them and not for anybody else. There was a rumor a couple of weeks ago that the new prosecutor, or the current prosecutor, was going to prosecute the United States for war crimes in Iraq. Somehow that talk has stopped. I don't know whether it's going to continue or not. But the idea of international law sort of being the basis of international behavior is starting to be tested. You have Donald Trump tearing up treaties. The Iranian treaty, he seems to believe is a bilateral America-Iran treaty. It's not. Actually, it's also a resolution of the UN Security Council under Chapter 7, so it's binding on everybody. But if you look at Russia, Russia is behaving increasingly authoritarian in its behavior. The Russians seem to want to talk about spheres of influence, about the near abroad. There's nothing in the UN Charter about the near abroad. There's nothing about spheres of influence. But what there is, what the Russians are up to is basically saying that, the rules don't apply to us. They were very legalistic and litigious at a time when they were weak at the UN. Now all of a sudden they've begun to behave as though the rules don't matter very much to them. Then you have China, which so far has not tried to upset the apple cart, but is being offered an opportunity in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific. That's basically the Americans the Trump administration looks like it's about to hand Asia to the Chinese on a platter. They're walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They don't want such trade agreements. NAFTA is another that they don't want. Well, absent the United States, which country is most likely to fill that vacuum? It's pretty obvious it's going to be China. So we're heading into a time when it's not a lot of the assumptions that we've made, the lessons that we thought we learned, to go back to what Louise said at the very beginning, after the Second World War, when we saw the conflict and the catastrophic consequences of that conflict, and we made our parents' generation, what's often been called the best generation, or the greatest generation, they made some very hard-headed decisions, and part of that was the creation of the UN. I was reading I did a little bit of preparation, as much as I could. They have 40 years of preparation. Anyway, I was reading a piece by Brookings where they invited experts to talk about American foreign policy, and people were talking about what's the relationship with China going to be, what's the relationship with Russia going to be, how are the Eastern Europeans going to handle this current situation, what's the future of NATO, what happens to the Iranian treaty, what happens to Syria, what about the refugees. Not a single one of those experts was asked to or did talk about what about U.S. relations with the UN. Does any, if you check, and I use my research assistant Google, you don't find almost anything that Trump has said about the UN other than that he could have renovated it cheaper than it turned out to be. That's almost the only direct quote. He also said that the UN is no friend of Israel. So that gives you some indication of where he's headed on that. Essentially, there is no regard. In fact, it's not, to my mind, the most important next question we're going to see answered by the Trump administration: who is Secretary of State? Because if there's a panoply of people it could be who would really be trouble. Seriously, would be happy to dismantle the UN if they could do it. And there were some other people who are very sound and very sensible. And this game keeps being played out in public, which is surprising. But the next very important choices are the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. And if you get the right people, then you may get some sort of sound triangulation of policy that takes place together with Congress. And the Congress can be expected not to let the U.S. administration run wild. But what we're looking at now is a question, under a question mark, is the future of the UN and the system of international rules and regulations. I don't think it's going to disappear. But, you know, how much pummeling can that organization take? I think Louise provided the most hopeful interpretation, which I share, which is, you know, there are a lot of other countries who aren't trivial. And as long as they see the UN as in their interest, the United States can go off on its own as it feels like. But the difficulty is, if you look at Erdogan in Turkey, you look at Horn and other Eastern European leaders, you look at Putin, you look at around the globe, there are a lot of authoritarians who are not very much interested in democracy. And Mr. Erdogan, president of Turkey, once said, you know, we'll take democracy is the train we'll take until we get to our destination. And I think that's sort of what we're seeing. And in those circumstances, it's going to be a lot more difficult world for the UN.
Kate White, do you have a perspective from the civil society point of view? I mean, you've been through a lot, a lighter version of what we're talking about in the past few years. What do you see any hopeful signs out there, or what in your view?
Well, of course, the realities of geopolitics at the moment suck badly. I mean, to not put too fine a point on it. But we are seeing moments. We are seeing, in fact, with China's rise, their interest in being engaged, and as Paul has said, other countries coming forward as well. I think, frankly, we've got Trump, unless I like to say he's indicted, and that's who we have. And I think that we have also seen at least a modest mitigation of his most inflammatory statements. And I think there are some direct impacts. So, for example, I don't think he'll be supportive of any big initiatives through the UN. I think that is just not likely to happen. There won't be a new, Paris Accord climate and so on. It will be interesting to see what we can do with the Sustainable Development Goals. As you know, in this room, a group of goals that the universally adopted and universally to be implemented. But I think even in the hint so far with Nikki Haley as potentially the new PR for the U.S. to the UN, Paul hinted at the kind of folks. In fact, I think there's 3 in the running that we know of: Petraeus, and the risk, which is Giuliani, and Mitt Romney. I think that there's some sanity and some potential in there. I think this global set of norms, it won't take very long to recognize that they're valuable to the U.S. as well. In fact, I was just at the Halifax International Security Conference and, talking about, how Trump feels about NATO, the multilateralism agenda in general was on the agenda. I think an important story that we need to remember is what an incredible deal UN peacekeeping is, what an incredible deal NATO is, and particularly for the Americans. And I know that there are people telling these stories and reminding Prime Minister-elect Trump that this is so. Thank you. Exactly. And in fact, I have to say, on so many of these issues, whether it's on the UK, I know Julia, my colleague here, what Brexit means, what we're seeing in France, this sort of sense of closing down of borders and retreating. It is interesting that at this time, Canada is actually quite open. And I think that face forward in the world is a great advantage at the moment in terms of these conversations, whether all conversations lead to whether, it's appropriate for a seat on the Security Council. I think that many of us in this room would agree that we need to stand up, our presence needs to be felt, we need to be offering the arguments, including the economic arguments, as well as the arguments for peace in being the broader society and focusing on social cohesion, on showcasing the value of immigration and welcoming refugees and so on. I feel firmly that this is an important time for Canada, and to make sure that we keep an oar in these ways with the UN system. I have to say, of course, I agree with Louise in terms of making sure that we are also fully engaged and understand the complexities and the depth of dispute that also is taking place right now. I also do want to tell you, though, and from our own polling, that Canadians by and large get it. They aren't romantics about the UN. They see the direct value to them. They see that it can meet our objectives. And I might say when I was meeting with conservative members of cabinet about the UN, I'd always say, for a country our size, there's also trade. I mean, if you only want to think about this as an exchange, the reality is you want to be a trusted partner of countries. And the way to build that trust is around those tables. And I think that's as true for Donald Trump and his cabinet of billionaires, that they need to give some thought to this as well.
Thanks very much, Kate. Louise, a last word to you before we open the floor to questions.
On the question of the future prospects for the UN, I agree with Paul and Kate that the UN is not going to be shut down anytime soon. First, we tend to focus on the Security Council and the political and peace and security issue, but in fact the UN is about every aspect of life in society. And I'm sure that even the Trump administration will see the importance and the need for them to work with all the UN agencies and so on. So the UN is a big place, and I'm sure they will continue to be actively engaged and perhaps positively engaged on many, many issues. Secondly, as Kate has said, even the Trump administration will quickly realize that it's a very useful tool for them. Yes, on many issues they will want to go unilateral and do whatever they think suits them. But there are a lot of issues where, frankly, they have an interest in managing a lot of secondary conflicts around the world. And I would be very surprised if they just walked away from the UN or the Security Council. But I would say, and that's the third and final point, that the UN we're going to see going forward is not going to be the UN that Paul and I lived in at the end of the Cold War and in the 15 to 20 years that followed. A UN that was very much driven by a vision based on our values, of the promotion of human rights, of the promotion of democracy. The responsibility to protect was an illustration of that. I think we're going to see a different UN because and this became the driving force in the UN because of the historical moment where Russia was down and lost all influence in the UN. China was very focused on its own internal economic challenges. There was a real movement and embrace of democracy in Latin America, in Africa, in Eastern Europe, and suddenly, at the end of the Cold War, there was a genuine convergence around these values, and that's what Fukuyama kept talking about. And we had, frankly, a unipolar world. There was one uncontested leader. The United States, broadly supported not only in the West, but by broad cross-sections of countries. That came to an end with the war in Iraq, frankly. their capacity to lead on the basis of this vision based on essentially Western values was squandered, I think, in Iraq. But in any case, I think it was going to be challenged by emerging powers who see things somewhat differently. I don't think we're going to go back to the days where countries could massacre their own citizens without the international community through the UN or elsewhere saying something. That was the case before the end of the Cold War. The genocide in Cambodia never made it to the Security Council. It was off limits. Internal affairs of countries were not a subject of cooperation in the UN or at the Security Council. I don't think we're going to go back to this world of indifference to human rights and protection of civilians, but I do think that there will be other views expressed, more constraints on the UN to act vigorously in that direction, and less space for consensus around solutions and approaches that are grounded in these values. And it means that we will have to be smart. We will have to be smart in how we promote these values, because the receptivity that we found 20 years ago is receding. It's no longer there. Aid money is not going to buy you a commitment to our vision of the world, to our values. We still believe in our values and we want to continue to promote them, but we'll have to find ways. And I think one of the ways is to reach out to countries in the South that share our vision. They may not have exactly the same agenda in terms of human rights, but there are a lot of partners out there we can work with. But it means we have to break away from our traditional partners. The U.S. played a very positive role in the promotion of these values. It would be very surprising if they did that. We'll have to find other partners, and it won't be just in Europe, or probably not mainly in Europe, because they're facing also all kinds of challenges. And we'll have to be imaginative too, because I'm not sure that we're looking at an era where money for aid projects of all kinds will be in great abundance. I see a retreat in the States and some of the, it's the era of myself and I and my welfare, I'm the priority. I need to look after myself, America first, and it's France first, and it's Brexit first. And so this is a very different era. I'm very glad we have a Prime Minister who nevertheless projects a message of hope and solidarity, but we'll have to be very, very smart in how we go about promoting our values.
Well, thank you very much, Louise. I wanted to open the floor now to questions. If there are no more comments from the panel, would you please just identify yourself for the purpose of the recording and be as succinct as you can in your question?
Shane Roberts, co-president of the local branch in the United Nations Association. I think for the moment, Louise Fréchette and I had a psychic link. The question was coming, and it was anticipating some of her final thoughts there. But I want to push her further than the other panelists, particularly, say, Catherine, with respect to she's gained a vantage point involved in the World Federation of the United Nations, and maybe Paul, and it's this. If the UN was born out of largely the European experience, the torment of World War II, also founded by the waning empires, the British, the French, and other colonial interests. With the new world we face now, what opportunities do you see, especially with the U.S. possibly being out of sync with the rest of the world? What partnerships are there, either in terms of things like G7, G20, or with particular individuals, the BRIC countries or others? Should the Canadian government been looking for new key partners to work in concert in the United Nations.
Thank you. Louise, Paul? Kate?
I thought he was pushing Louise, but I'm happy.
I always say I don't have anything to say.
Yeah, I think it's an important point, finding other partners. One of the things we have to worry about, I think, is if we go into a world if it's a multipolar world, we're pretty close to one of the poles. I don't think that we don't have the option of being part of the Chinese orbit or the Russian orbit or the Brazilian orbit or whatever our other orbits are. We're very firmly in the American orbit. At the same time, we've seen with the, depending on how you view the pipeline into the U.S., we've seen that what happens when you put all your eggs in one basket. The Americans take your eggs and give you a discounted price for them. So we really, it is important to have other options out there. But as for the G20, the G20 was the best idea anybody ever had, except that it didn't work. It worked. It was very effective, I think, in bringing the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 to a close. And since that time, and creating the Financial Stability Forum or Board, I guess it's a board, under the leadership of our former Governor of the Bank of Canada, Mr. Carney. But if you look at what else it's accomplished, it gets pretty skinny. And part of the reason is that countries like China and Brazil and others don't want to play in that game particularly. They see more advantage in being in the larger UN forum than they do. And the Chinese might be tempted by a G2, but the G20 doesn't hold any particular romance for them because they can get their way at the UN readily enough. Louise, do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I'd say that there are a lot of countries like us who are not keen to become totally attached to a polar country, see great merit in a universal forum where, like us, they think that they can better defend their interests if they're common goals. So we're not alone in that notion. I'm not sure that I would bank, however, the building of relationship entirely on multilateral forum. I'm a multilateralist by profession right now, but I would invest quite a bit in bilateral relations. I think our government, I'm still waiting to get a sense of what their global game plan is vis-a-vis the rest of the world. But I would like to see a good chunk of it built around cultivating bilateral relations in all regions of the world, and frankly, the one region that I think requires less attention is probably Europe, because you have all these existing links, but where we have to rebuild links. I'm thinking of countries like Chile, Argentina, and Mexico, and Peru, and then in every continent you will find that there are countries that actually care about the international system of norms, see value in it. Now, I think once you invest in bilateral relationships, then you can choose where you will tap your partners around specific issues, because we tend to have a fairly broadly based agenda. Many of these countries have a narrower agenda because they're small or whatever, but bilateral relations are important, and the personal links that can be established between the Prime Minister and his counterparts, but also our ministers. If they sit in Ottawa the whole time, not sure we will build the right kind of relationship.
Kate White?
So this may not be it. In fact, it may be talking about multilateralism. But I will tell you the interesting conversations I have had with countries interested in an old role that Canada used to have, and that is in interpreting the United States to them. Do you remember we had a role as interlocutor, probably during the Bush years as well? And this is, I mean, I've been approached to say, you know, which is interesting. Now, again, of course, I'm a multilateralist. Of course, I wouldn't have to say that. But I think at those tables, that conversation remains important. So I can remember, I don't know whether it's Bill Roshinsky, it actually might have been this guy when he was our PR, saying about Canada doing a deal with, you know, a country that also, you know, had the letter C because you were sitting beside them in the GA or, you know, having conversations beside them. I always had a bit of a challenge with the G20 besides its work around the financial crisis. In a way, the whole point of the UN and the UN system is internationalists, that you invite everyone to the table. I think that these groupings are more expedient, and they're things that we can seize from time to time. But I don't necessarily think that this mini multilateralism is the way forward. And I'm just going to take the privilege of the mic, if I can, on this and other issues, to say that as we await, again, this sort of unfolding of a global vision from the government, I can say that I've seen the work and the efforts and the innovations of the new government's PR in New York, and I think that in this room that we would be very impressed with what's going on in those relationships that are being built.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Yes, sir.
My name is Paul Benoit, and I have a question for Madame Fréchette, just following up on some of your comments, which I enjoyed, but perhaps just pushing them a little bit further when you talked about the need for Canada to arrive at a better understanding of the world and some of its realities. Isn't it the time really for Canada now to engage in a bit of reflection, critical reflection on just how the world has changed? And perhaps that critical reflection could even go so far as to examine the assumptions that were really built in to our multilateral institutions, not just at the end of the Cold War, but at the end of World War II. And I think of a lot of the institutions, whether it's in the commercial field, security, peacekeeping, etc. There may, through historical circumstances at that time, have been a consensus on the way forward. I think now what we're seeing in the world is the end of that consensus on some of those assumptions that are the foundation of the multilateral organizations that Canada has proudly been a part of for a long time. And wouldn't the alternative, or part of the critical reflection along those lines, lead towards a recognition of what I call regional integration based on cultural and civilizational grounds, that we're now seeing the reawakening of very old cultures and civilizations that are rightly claiming a place in the sun and are going about at very many levels at creating institutions to reflect that. And so the rules and norm making that you spoke about and that were driven by the United Nations, it's not that they're not going to be any anymore, but those rules and norms are going to be grounded in what I call civilizational and cultural basins. And I think part of our reflection that a country like Canada is well positioned to engage in should be along those lines, and I'd love to hear your comment on that.
Thank you, Paul.
I think it's a very good question. You already have an answer. I don't know whether that's the full answer, if only because some regions, in fact, have been functioning as regions for a long time. It's never been felt when you're inside the UN as inimical to the UN. The emergence of the African Union, for instance, is welcome. So long as there's a connection to the universal system, because otherwise you create chaos. Actually, it's welcome. Latin America for a long, long time has operated as a regional benefits. They solve most of their political problems. They solve them inspired by the Charter of the UN, but they do it their own way. China, for the time being, Asia does not have that kind of institutions. They have some things on the trade side or on the economic side, but security institutions in Asia are very weak at the moment, and a region like the Middle East has had for a long time some institution, the Arab League, but it's clearly insufficient. So I don't know whether regional bodies are the entire solution. But I do think that your question is absolutely bang on, and I want to give an example that has nothing to do with the Canadian government per se, but I mentioned at the beginning I'm involved with a big NGO, Care International, and we're slowly coming around to the realization that the environment in which we operated for 70 years is suddenly changing around us. That the notion of Western donors coming in with their money, their project, even if most of the staff is local, is probably not the appropriate business model in many, many countries now. Furthermore, there's new ways of thinking about how you generate development that is less focused on community projects and more on more systemic changes. Even humanitarian, emergency relief is undergoing pretty rapid change with the distribution of money card rather than the distribution of food. So, and you add to that a lot of countries that now have their own capacity. So the civil society groups also have to ask themselves precisely that sort of question. I can tell you that from the point of view of my NGO, it's very challenging. And I think from the point of view of governments and our government, it requires a willingness to revisit. I don't know whether the UN will survive in its current form, and I'm not even positive that it must. Maybe there are other ways. I haven't seen a blueprint to replace it yet, but maybe new blueprints will emerge, because indeed the world is changing very fast, and many of the dynamics that created what we lived with for decades are now changing. So, thank you.
Comment on that. One of the things that Louise had said was that she was waiting to see the sort of outlines of the new government's policy for the world, and I fear that you're going to wait further for that, because while we have an aid policy review and we have a defense policy review, we don't have a foreign policy review. The last foreign policy review was too painful, apparently, to be repeated. And the conventional wisdom became that real countries don't review foreign policy, they make foreign policy. And apparently, therefore, that we seem to think that we fit into that category. But in reality, absent some idea of where you're going now, any road will do. Some principles, some. If you look at what the United States does every couple of years, there's a strategic policy review. It's about 15 or 20 pages, unlike our last foreign policy review, which I think was 130 pages. And they managed to set out their priorities and to guide their policy for the next 2 years on the basis of that document. So if it's good enough for the Americans to review foreign policy, at least in that level, then I would think it would be good enough for us. On the G20, the G20 is a great missed opportunity. I think it was an idea whose time had come and gone. If you look at reforming of the UN, all the countries that are problems on the reform of the UN are in the G20. if you could sort out some sort of consensus on the reform of the UN in G20, you would have no trouble selling that idea in the Security Council and in the UN General Assembly more broadly. And if you look at big issues like the climate change negotiations, all of those negotiations are not, there aren't 193 countries sitting around every table. They break those down into smaller groups of people who are particularly concerned or of particular interest, and you try to sort that out. So that in essence, the G20 would be performing the same kind of function on a number of questions that these smaller groups perform in the U.S. or in the UN. And when you get a consensus on the G20 or in the G20, that's as good as you're 90% on there. When you operate in the larger groups and you let countries like Pakistan have a veto because it has to work by consensus, that you get the Disarmament Commission where you haven't had an agenda for about 20 or 30 years because they won't agree to it. And all kinds of important things are held up constantly.
Thanks very much, Paul. Well, I'm told that we're running out of time, so we just have time for one more question, and then we'll do a wrap-up. Thanks.
Good here, John.
Good evening. My name is Elliot Cho. I'm a student at Calgary University, first year MA in political science. I'll try to keep my questions as brief as possible. So my question has to do with Russia. And going back to 2014, we all know that the annexation of Crimea occurred. And I think this was a very shocking event that has proven that the state sovereignty or the state's mutual respect for the state sovereignty is no longer matter in the era that we live in. And as mentioned in the talk, the Russians' attitude that their belief that the rules in UN or in the international law doesn't apply to us is very concerning. So what can Canada, as a member of the UN, can do to help or persuade Russia to turn away from this path to isolation or perhaps to self-destruction?
I see Chris Westall here. He would be better, but I wouldn't say that Russia is on the path to self-destruction when it invades Crimea and makes trouble in Ukraine. In fact, it was a very revealing moment at the UN when the Security Council, of course, couldn't agree on what to do because Russia had veto. So then it went to the General Assembly, 195 members. Well, they didn't get 195 votes to condemn the action of the Russians. I think they got barely 100. That tells you something about the fact that not all countries are prepared to stick their neck out to oppose a major country when they have interests at stake, or simply because most countries have very, very narrow agenda. There are a few things they care deeply about. They're going to invest everything. So it is a tall order to use the multilateral system to put pressure on Russia. But it still is the best place to do it because bilaterally, I'm not sure that we have that much to use by way of leverage to modify behavior. I don't know. Chris, what do you think? You know Russia well. Tell us.
Off the top of my head, where to begin? The notion that we had a system of laws and rules and procedures that the nations of the earth were going to respect, I think is in some question now. And I think that is a sense of crisis. But my view is that security trumps the law. countries will if they can, serve their security interests despite what the rules and the laws might be. And I think that criticism of Russian action coming from the United States that has time and again ignored international rules is a bit rich. I think that the Russian reaction in Crimea was not aggression so much as it was a reaction to what had been strategic aggression. Strategic aggression in the form of the expansion of NATO, strategic aggression in the form of the unilateral abrogation of the ABM Treaty. No leader of Russia could have ignored the prospect in February of 2014 that suddenly Sevastopol, the base of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, was going to have to be rented from a NATO member. That this had been done by the Maidan, who had thrown out an international agreement that we had welcomed and had declared overnight that, one, the Russian language was being degraded in Ukraine, and security posts were being taken over by noted Russophobic extremists, and that Ukraine was going to join NATO. It was not Putin's aggression to react to that strategic calamity. And he was not, and no Russian leader was going to be stopped by the notion, oh, by the way, it would be against the rules to react. Security trumps the law. If you want a little law, you need a little order.
Okay.
And I'm afraid that
but I think this is not the purpose tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Chris Westall. And if there are no more comments on the last question from the panel, let's thank you, Margaret. Take it away.
Louise, Kate, Paul, Randall, when we consider that one of the core missions for the CIC, the Canadian International Council, was formed in 1925 as the predecessor organization, has been to try and encourage, promote, engage in discussion on issues of the day, discussion on, and how shall I say, efforts to try and make sense of a chaotic, messy, and sometimes very troubling international landscape. There are some who claim that we live in a post-fact era, that in an era of communication by tweets, that you don't really need to understand the issues. Some even claim you don't need organizations like the UN. I think tonight we've heard that, in fact, the opposite is true. It's times like now that ever more we need better understanding, not only among current and former practitioners, but also among the young, which is why the CIC sees it as our mission to work with youth, with students, with young professionals. By what you four are doing, Louise, through not only engagements like tonight, through the work with CARE, Paul, through your work with students, through books, the articles that you write, Kate, the multifaceted activities of your organization, both in Canada and internationally. Randolph and Paul, for your support to the CIC National Capital Branches Board. Thank you all, each and every one. And thank you all for being such a fabulous audience.